Welcome to Check This Out,
a podcast for kids and their grown-ups where we explore interesting people, places, ponderings, and past moments from history that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Today is the final episode in our series on
President Mini Episodes.
This week, we've done mini episodes on the first 7 presidents of the United States as we lead up to President's Day. Hopefully, you've gotten to hear the mini episodes on George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Today, we are going to introduce you to 7th President Andrew Jackson.
Well, hello. Nice to meet you.
It's always fun to meet another person from history.
Let's get into it.
Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 in a small frontier settlement in the Carolinas. His parents were Scotch-Irish immigrants, and his father died just 3 weeks before Jackson was born. His education as a child in poverty was inconsistent, but the schooling he did receive was interrupted by the Revolutionary War. Andrew Jackson was one of only 3 presidents who served in the Revolutionary War. Do you remember who the other 2 are? Was it
A,
George Washington and John Adams?
B,
Thomas Jefferson and George Washington?
C,
George Washington and James Monroe? The answer is C, George Washington and James Monroe. Andrew Jackson was young when the Revolutionary War happened. He enlisted at the age of 13, but he was too young for regular service, so he served as a messenger. When he was 15, he was taken prisoner by the British, and he was famously struck across the face by a British officer.
Why, Mama?
The officer wanted Andrew Jackson to shine his boots, and he refused. The officer struck Jackson across the face, leaving a scar.
Ouch!
His military experience before becoming president was a major player in how Andrew Jackson made it to the White House.
What do you mean, Mama?
Andrew Jackson was a different type of president. Before Jackson, all presidents had extensive administrative and diplomatic roles. Jackson had never been overseas, and he never held a cabinet job before becoming president.
My mind is blown.
Andrew Jackson was the first quote-unquote self-made man and the first Westerner to reach the White House. Remember, he was born into poverty and he had to work to grow his status, education, and financial position. While he ultimately gained wealth, he relied heavily on slaves to achieve this, and he enslaved over 150 people in his life.
That was terrible.
Let's talk a little more about Andrew Jackson and his journey to the White House, because it helps us understand some of the choices he made as president. I'm going to share a few facts with you about his life before the presidency.
Fact number 1.
After the Revolutionary War, he continued his education. He studied law and moved to Tennessee. He had a successful legal career based in Nashville. Keep in mind, this was before Tennessee had become a state, and Nashville was still considered a frontier town or Western.
Fact number 2.
Jackson was always interested in politics. He was the first man elected from Tennessee to the House of Representatives, and he served in the Senate. In 1796, he joined a convention that drafted the Constitution for the new state of Tennessee. And in 1802, Jackson was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia.
Fact number 3.
Andrew Jackson gained incredible popularity for his role in the War of 1812 against Britain, and many credit his military leadership with his ability to win the presidency in the popular vote.
Tell me everything!
In 1814, Jackson led his troops to a major victory in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. This battle destroyed the Red Sticks, which was a faction of the Creek Indians. This victory resulted in the United States obtaining 20 million acres of indigenous land in what is now Georgia and Alabama. Jackson had another success at the Battle of New Orleans against the British. On January 8th of 1815, he led his troops to victory, even though his militia of 5,000 were outnumbered by the British 2-1.
He sounds really brave.
Andrew Jackson was a man who didn't back down from a fight. He was a known dueler and had feuds with people he disliked. But now that you have a little information about Andrew Jackson, let's get into his time as president. He was the 7th president of the United States, and he served 2 terms from 1829 to 1837. If you listened to our episode on John Quincy Adams, you may remember that the first time Andrew Jackson ran for president, he lost to Adams because no one had received the majority of electoral votes needed to become president. And Congress chose Adams as the winner of that election.
I remember hearing about that.
I'm glad. Jackson and his supporters called this loss to Adams the corrupt bargain, and it fueled their focus for the election of 1828. Jackson won the presidency in 1828 by a huge margin. His campaign focused on being a champion for the common man, and he was incredibly popular because of his time as a military leader. But his time as president is remembered for a few key items. The first, Jackson believed in more people having a say in government. He supported the idea that all white men should be able to vote. One of his top priorities as president was to pay off the national debt, which he accomplished. In his 8 years as president, Congress was only able to pass one major law, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. During his presidency, Jackson vetoed 12 bills, which was more than all 6 previous presidents had vetoed combined. Andrew Jackson dominated his cabinet of advisors, forcing out members who wouldn't do what he wanted. He went through 4 secretaries of state and 5 secretaries of the Treasury.
Here's a fun fact.
Jackson had a giant 1,400-pound block of cheese in the White House.
Huh?
He received it as a gift in 1835, and he kept it in the White House lobby for 2 years. Here are just a couple more things to note about his presidency, aside from the cheese. During his time as president, something called the nullification crisis happened in 1832. And this was where some states wanted to ignore or nullify federal laws that they didn't like. Jackson stood firm and said states couldn't just choose not to follow federal laws. And this helped to keep the country united. He did have to threaten military action to get the states to agree. He ultimately established the modern-day Democratic Party. And as president, he had several nicknames, including Old Hickory and the People's President.
I learned something new today.
The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is one of Jackson's most lasting and complicated legacies. This law led to the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their homes in the southeastern part of the United States to lands west of the Mississippi River. Thousands of indigenous Americans were forced to leave behind their homes and belongings. When the massive amount of Native Americans began their journeys west of the Mississippi, this was called the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears resulted in immense suffering and loss of life, and it left a really dark mark on Jackson's legacy. The Trail of Tears is so big, we're actually going to do a future episode on this specific moment in history.
I want to check out more about that.
Jackson's time as president was a mix of democratic reforms, solidifying presidential power, and harsh policies towards Native Americans, and largely ignoring enslaved individuals and women. He's remembered as a champion of the common man, key emphasis on white man, and a controversial figure responsible for injustices such as enslavement, mistreatment of his slaves, harsh treatment of indigenous groups, and the Trail of Tears. A lot happened during his life and his presidency. We could keep going, but we did promise you a mini episode. So with that,
thanks for listening. See you next episode. Don't forget to subscribe.
Sources for this week's episode are included in the episode description.